All right, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to be doing an overview of Portuguese genealogy. And this is, like I said, an overview. There are many topics that we're going to kind of touch on today that can be its own program itself. And whenever we get the handout posted, there will be links of more resources for the different places we're talking about. And you want to go more in depth on any of the topics that I mentioned. And I also want to mention that I'm not a native Portuguese speaker, so I apologize in advance for any mispronunciations. I am learning to speak Portuguese some, so hopefully I won't do too badly. So when we're talking about Portugal, there are actually several areas of the world that we are covering. There's mainland Portugal, the Iberian Peninsula, and then there's the autonomous regions, which is the Azores and Madeira Islands. Those are several hundred miles from the mainland area in the Atlantic Ocean. And there are also the former colonies of Portugal. The largest is Brazil, but there are also several other in Africa and in Asia. We're not really going to touch on these other than Brazil today, but for the most part, to research those former colonies, you're going to have to dig into the archives for those countries. So this is a very abbreviated timeline of the Portuguese history. It has been considered a kingdom since 1143, and before that, it was controlled by the Moors. Most of those were driven out by the 1200s. And Portugal has always had a strong maritime culture, so they were very big in the early exploration of what they considered the New World. So that was basically anywhere outside of Europe. They landed in Brazil in 1500, and in 1536 is the Portuguese Inquisition. Before that, in 1497, that's when you get the expulsion or the first conversion in any of the Jewish people that were still in Portugal. And the Inquisition actually went on until the 1800s. In 1755, there was a big earthquake outside of Lisbon. It's actually considered one of the largest in the world, and also caused a lot of tsunamis. And so that was a big devastating moment in Portuguese history. And some of those records from that time period might have been destroyed, especially in the areas that were right next to the coast. So in 1822, Brazil becomes independent. And in 1910, the monarchy of Portugal was overthrown and a republic was created. However, they went under a fascist dictatorship in 1933, and that dictatorship lasted until the 70s. And then all of the African colonies and all of the Asian colonies received their independence by 1975. And today, for mainland Portugal, you can see on the map, there are 18 administrative districts. This is kind of like here in the US with the states, and it's kind of like an American equivalent almost. And each of these districts are going to have their own archives. So today, Portugal is very homogeneous ethnically. So an estimated 95% are considered ethnically Portuguese. 80% today are still Roman Catholic, and before this time period, it was 90%, almost 100 at times in history. There is a small Protestant section in Portugal. There are some Islamic sections, and there is a very, very small Jewish community in Portugal now. Most of these are actually immigrants who have moved to Portugal, and then the others are under other religions or agnostic. And many Portuguese today actually do have some Jewish ancestry from the converse, the former Sephardic Jewish community in Portugal. Some scholars estimate it's up to 40% of the population has some Jewish ancestry. So one event to note is the 1911 orthographic agreement. And this is when they were kind of really wanting to consolidate the languages and the spellings, kind of set standardized spellings of things. So if you're looking at records from before 1911, the same word might be spelled differently today. The main things are there's no longer Y, K, or W, except in foreign words in the Portuguese language. So those letters have been replaced. Anything that's like PH, CH, RH, those have all been changed to just single letters usually. So when you're requesting records from any Portuguese institutions, you want to use the post-1911 spellings regardless of the time period that you're looking at, because that is how they're going to have them today. However, if you yourself are looking through records, you want to keep in mind how it was spelled before 1911, because those prior records were not changed. So with Portuguese given names, Manuel was usually given to the firstborn son. Maria was given usually to the firstborn daughter, but it's not uncommon to find multiple daughters in the same family with the name Maria. Usually they will have the name Maria and then a second name. Today, the civil registry actually has a list of approved given names that people have to choose from. And it's a very long list. It's like 80 pages with 4 or 5 columns. So they're not being restricted to like 20 names or anything, but they do have to be an approved name. And also with Portuguese records, when you're looking at indexes, those are organized by given names, not surnames. So that can be a little tricky sometimes because you're going to see a lot of like Marias all in a row that way whenever you're looking in the indexes. With the Portuguese surnames, most of them are going to fall under the patronymic, toponymic, or the nature and religious categories. They don't really do surnames based off professions as much as some of the other European countries do. Religious and devotional names are especially common for women, and we'll kind of get into that here in a minute, but that's because that's usually the only surname they have. And then for the Sephardic Jewish community, those who were converted or were first forcibly baptized, they may have taken a new legal name after they converted. A lot of times they would have taken the name of like a godparent or a sponsor. And those names do tend to be under the patronymic, so something like Rodriguez. However, there is no set pattern. So you can't just look at a surname and be like, that was someone who converted. Although in the past, people believed that it was names that were nature or religious, but that has been disproven now. So the biggest roadblock in doing Portuguese genealogy is going to be the surnames, because they don't really follow a set naming pattern with their surnames, their family names. And the further back you research, the more flexible and where they're deriving their surname from. Once you get to the mid to late 1800s, they're starting to get in more of a pattern in what surname they're using, but before that, it's not so much. So when they were born or baptized, they were not given a surname, and they chose one or adopted one, usually around the ages between 16 or 20. And this is usually when they were starting to become old enough to have to do legal documents, so things like marriage records or contracts. And with those, you needed a surname or a given family name. So that's why they kind of waited until they were older. So usually it's going to be a surname in their family line. So a parent or a grandparent, every now and then they might take the surname of a godparent. Boys might tend to kind of choose their father's names. Girls might tend to choose their mother's names. But again, this is not a given. And we'll see that here in a second. This is kind of as close to a pattern that you might find, though. Women did not really have surnames, but they were usually given a given name and then a devotional name. So like Rosa Perpetua Clara de Rosario. And those devotional names might be passed down to their daughters. And so they might serve as a surname, but they wouldn't have had a legal surname in the way that we think of them today. And then today, the Portuguese do use the two surnames, the maternal and the paternal surnames. So we're going to look at a couple of examples here of surnames and the different names in the family, so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about here when I say that they chose names and they weren't following patterns. So we have Antonio Quaresma de Rosa. He was born in the 1860s in Pico, Azores. And as you can see, his father's name is Pimentel, and his paternal grandfather is also Pimentel, but he is de Rosa, and that Rosa is actually from his maternal grandfather. And his middle name, Quaresma, is actually Portuguese for Lent. So that was a name they tended to give people who were born usually in the springtime, so about February through April during the Lenten season. We can see, however, that this seems to be a family name. I believe Antonio and Manuel were both born in like March, April. However, Antonio, the elder, was not. So it may have just been a family name they passed down. And this is Antonio's wife, Francisca Conceição Quaresma. She was born in the 1860s, also in Pico. And that name, Conceição, is a maternal devotional name that was passed down from her maternal grandmother. However, the Quaresma is not matching up with anyone else's surnames. Francisca did move to America in the 1880s, and that is where she and Antonio married, and they had their first son there. And on both her marriage record and her son's birth record in the US, they have her surname as Perry, which is an anglicized version of the name Parida, which is a name that her father had. So why she used that instead of Quaresma is I couldn't really figure out. Quaresma she was born in July, so she wasn't born during the Lenten season. So I'm not really sure where she is pulling that name from. So in Portugal, there are two main national archives, the Torre de Tombo and then the Histórico Ultramarino. The Torre de Tombo is the main national one, and that is the one you see pictured there. And it has the government historical cultural records, the Inquisition records are there, and it also serves as the district archives for Lisbon because that is where it is located. And they also have personal family records there. And then the Ultramarino archives, that covers more of the countries outside of the mainland. So if your family is from one of the autonomous regions or from one of the former colonies, this archive may have more records related to your family. You get a lot of like cargo lists and passports and things like that. So in April of this year, this website here, the DGLAB, actually went live, and it's a conglomerate of most of the National Archives and most of the district archives digital collections. So the district archives may still have their own digital website, but for the most part, most of those records have been merged into just this one website here. And you do have an option to translate the page to English. However, if you are searching, you still need to use Portuguese terms. So what I like to do is I like to open up Google Translate to help me so that way I can copy and paste the Portuguese terms with all of the correct accent marks whenever I'm doing searches on this website. Because if you use the English terms, you're probably not going to get as many results show up. Some other really good main resources. There's tobo.port. This is not associated with the archives, but this is kind of another governmental resource, and it has indexes of all the different types of records for all the different places, and also has links to the relevant websites and archives for you to go to. You can also look on Family Search. Family Search has a lot of the records. Most of them are on microfilm, and you do have to be at a family history center to view the actual images from almost all of the Portuguese records on there. You only get the transcriptions. But those can be helpful when you then go to find the original records in the DGLAB website. And there's also a lot of wiki pages on Family Search. And those are pages that kind of go over like what records you might be able to find and where you might be able to find them. And those are really great resources. Ancestry and MyHeritage only have indexes as far as I've seen. And then this book, The Genealogist's Handbook for Portuguese Research, is a really, really great resource. When I was doing Portuguese research, the book was like glued to me. So I highly recommend using that book when you're doing research. So for the different vital records, 1911 is when the civil registry for Portugal was established. So before 1911, your only source of vital records are going to be the Catholic Church parish records. Most of those are in the parishes, but you can also look in diocesan archives. Pre-1563, most of those church records are going to focus almost exclusively on nobility or upper class. 1563 is when the Catholic Church said that priests needed to start recording everyone in their parishes, not just the rich. So you may find some family records going before 1563. I think it just kind of depended on the priest on whether or not he was including everyone in those records. But for the most part, if you can find the parishes where your family were living, you can get back to at least that mid-1500s date. And then there are the public records. So those are going to be the records from after 1911. For birth records, to wait 100 years after the birth. Marriages are 50 years, and then death records are 30 years. So if you're wanting anything that kind of falls within that range, so if you're wanting a birth record that is from less than 100 years, you're going to have to request that from the civil registry office in the district that they are from. So there are different types of church records besides just, your baptism, marriage, burial records. There are the marriage proceedings. So those are kind of like the prenuptial documentation. Those were probably going to fall more in nobility or upper class marriages. There's the marriage dispositions. So those were in case of, if they were related, or they were married before, or if they were marrying someone who wasn't Catholic, they needed permission from a bishop to marry. Most of those have not been digitized from what I've read. However, if you can get those, apparently with the ones where they're related, those will include family trees, showing how they're related. And those you would have to get from the church where they were trying to get married at. And then there's the legitimization records. That's when a father legally recognized an illegitimate child, or if parents were married after the child was born, then the child would be considered legitimate. And this little chart over here kind of tells you what all you can find in the different records. If with baptismal records, those are really great because they're giving you the child's name, the parents' names, and the grandparents' names. So you're getting 3 generations in one baptismal record. And that is especially useful when you're going to look for the parents' marriage record because you already know what their parents' names are, and that can help verify that you have the correct marriage record. Also useful is they tell you where the family's from, if they're from different parishes. So if they're from the same parish that they're getting married or baptized or being buried, it's just going to say same. But if they're from a different parish, they're going to say what parish that is. So then you know to go look in that parish for those marriage records and birth records. So this is an example of a baptismal record from 1909 for Maria de Carmo, or as some of you may know her, it's Carmen Miranda. She was actually born in mainland Portugal before her family moved to Brazil, I believe when she was about 4 or 5. But this kind of handwriting is the style for this time period, and that is kind of one thing as you're going through these records is the different time periods have different styles of writing. Some of them you can read real easily, and then some of them not so much. But you can see we get the baptismal date, we get the parish and diocese that she's in, we get the birth date, the parents' names. Her father was a barber and her mother was a weaver. And then it gives her paternal grandparents and the maternal grandparents' names. So you have all the information you need from here to then go look for her parents and grandparents, their marriage records and their baptismal records. And then someone has also very helpfully underlined the names here in this record. So this is a marriage record from 1763. As you can see, this style of writing is a little bit more difficult to read. You're also getting bleed through from the ink from the other side. So sometimes with these marriage records, you may have to kind of adjust the images to try and be able to read what they say. But with this, it mentions that the groom's parents are actually from a different parish than the one that they're getting married in. So when you go If you were to go look for Jose's baptismal record, you're going to be looking in this parish instead of São Miguel. And this is an example of a burial record from the 1860s. These don't tend to have as much information. One thing that's really useful is they will say if they were still married or if they are widows. So if you're unsure when someone died, you can kind of tell. So we know that this Maria, she died before her husband because it says she's casada or still married. If her husband had died before her, it would say widow. And then it also gives her parents' names as well. So outside of church records, when it comes to like census records, Portugal has done several national census throughout history. However, they always destroyed the census after they pulled all of the statistics from those census records. So we only have kind of like the final tallying from those census records are the only things that still exist, and they've been doing those since the 1200s. There are a couple census like records that do still exist, but they don't have names or anything. They're just the numbers. So on a national level, you're not really going to find a whole lot when it comes to census records. However, if you look at kind of a local, like a district, or even like a city or municipal area within a district, they may have their own census records that they may have taken. In 1822, they did start doing elector lists. So these were the lists of men who were eligible to vote. And they also did census of young men for the military registration. So you can find those as well. And those are usually found on the local level. The closest thing that you're going to be able to find that is, the most similar to what we see in US Census records are the parish census records. Those were taken when a bishop was going to visit a parish, and you can see examples of these here. And those are going to be in district archives or with the parishes. If you're looking at them before 1896, they're all going to be handwritten. After 1896, there's actually a form where they would fill it out. But again, when you're looking through these, they may or may not have surnames with, so they can be a little bit tricky to search. Internet Archive actually has most of them from the Azores online, and so you can view those for free. If you're wanting, again, to look outside of the Azores, those are going to be in the district archives most likely. So the other two types of records to look for when you're doing these Portuguese research are passports and military records. Passport indexes, almost all of those have now been digitized. You can find them in like the Torre de Tobo website or in district archives. You can also find indexes on Family Search, and those will contain, names, ages, occupations, who they're traveling with, where they're going, the name of the ship. So those are really good resources. And then with military records, there's a lot of records for both the Army and Navy. Some have been digitized. I believe most of them you do have to like visit or contact the specific archives. So the Histórico Militar is kind of a general military history archive. The Geral de Exército is the Army, and the Marina, that is the Navy archives. And I have looked at the Navy archives, and they do have a lot of stuff digitized on there. It just takes a while for them to load because they scan them at such high resolution. And when you're looking through the Navy archives, something to look for are the fishermen's registration. Portuguese, again, they have a very strong maritime culture. Fishing, whaling, sailing, those are all going to be major occupations for people. And so you're going to be able to find a lot of those registrations in the naval archives. So the Azores Islands is composed of 9 islands. They were first discovered by the Portuguese in 1427. There is some evidence that there were people there beforehand, but I think they had left the islands long before the Portuguese got there. In 1466, there was actually a push to recruit Flemish people to move to the Azorian Islands because Henry the Navigator, who was the ruler of Portugal at the time, he realized that if everyone from Portugal moved to the Azores, there wouldn't be anyone left in the mainland. and they wanted to get people that were still Catholic. So they went to Flanders, which was in some turmoil at the time, and they convinced a lot of them to move to the Azores. So people whose family are from the Azores, it's not uncommon to find some Flemish ancestry show up when they're doing DNA tests or doing research. And then the islands became autonomous in 1976. Throughout this time period, there are a lot of major earthquakes and mudslides that did occur on the different islands. And so there might be gaps in the records and what you find because they may have been destroyed in an earthquake. Then there are 3 main archives, one on Fayal, one on Terceira, and then one on São Miguel. I believe the one in Ponta Delgada is kind of the main one there. And then there are councils. Each island is kind of split up into councils. If you're thinking of Portugal as a country, and then you get the Azores, the islands, estates, and then the municipal councils are kind of almost like counties in a way. And so they also have their own records as well. So if you are doing Azorean research, this website right here is going to be your best friend. They've digitized the parish records, and they have also digitized the passports from the 3 main ports. So you have to know the island. This is the council, so that's again kind of like an American equivalent of a county. And then this is the parish. So sometimes if you don't know the parish, you will kind of have to go through the parishes. The records on here, however, aren't like indexed exactly. So you do kind of have to go page by page through a book to find what you're looking for. But you can find a lot of stuff on this website here. And then there's a couple of other websites that are really good if you're doing Azores research, and those will be in the handout. So for Madeira, it's closer to Portugal than the Azores are, so they were discovered a little bit earlier. The main thing with these islands is they were big exporters of sugarcane and also wine. And so they had kind of stronger trading partnerships with other countries, whereas the Azores was kind of like a stop. This is kind of like a rest stop on the way across the Atlantic. Madeira was actually more involved in trade. At one point, it was actually occupied by the British. But then again, it became autonomous in 1976. And there's only one archive, and it's for all 3 of the islands and all of the municipal councils on the island, and that is in Funchal, which is the main one here on the southern part of the island. Family Search and Ancestry and MyHeritage all have indexes for like the various vital records, and also passport registrations. They have indexes for those as well. And then here at the Genealogy Center, we actually do have some of those parish registers digitized on microfilm for the Funchal region. This is going to be a very brief overview of Brazilian genealogy. This is definitely something that could be its own program. So I apologize in advance if I don't go as in-depth as you would like on this. We're just kind of doing a brief highlight of doing Brazilian research. So Brazil, the Portuguese landed Brazil in 1500, and it becomes independent in 1822. Brazil actually started their own civil registration in 1870, so that's 40 years before Portugal. They ended enslavement in 1888, and then they had a republic. They do have various dictatorships from the 1930s through the 1980s, and before they became a democracy in 88. So there is a national archive in Rio de Janeiro that is like the whole national one, and then each state has its own archive. So some highlights from the national archives are the port registers and the National Register of Foreigners. And so if you have family that moved to Brazil from Portugal, you should be able to find those registers and that information in the national archives. And then if you're looking for things like the civil registrations, any census records, and any other kind of records that you would normally look for genealogy, most of those are in state archives. Whether or not those are digitized is entirely up to the state. So you might find one state where they have everything digitized, and then you might come across another state where they have nothing digitized. And in that case, you would have to contact the archives there to get those records. And just a note for people who were enslaved, they did actually keep records of them. They're usually found at like the end of a volume. So like at the end of a marriage volume or at the end of a baptismal volume, they then recorded the records for the enslaved people. And then Family Search has some Brazilian records, and they especially have the immigrant register from Ilha de Flores, which was called like a Brazilian Ellis Island. It's where a lot of people who are moving to Brazil, they would have been processed through this port, and Family Search has those records on their website. So again, this is another big topic we're going to just talk about briefly, and that's Sephardic genealogy. There were large communities throughout Portugal before 1497. That is when the ruler of Portugal was told basically by Spain to kick them out or convert them. Many fled to North Africa, especially Morocco. The Netherlands is another place, Amsterdam. That's where a lot of Sephardic Jewish people ended up going to. They also went to various areas in the Ottoman Empire, which was considered more religiously tolerant at the time. And so that would be places like Greece or Turkey. There was a very large Sephardic Jewish community in Greece before World War II. And today, actually, Portugal is still offering citizenship to people who can prove that they have Sephardic ancestry tracing back to Portugal. Spain used to offer citizenship as well, but I don't think they do anymore. But Portugal still is, as far as I've been able to find. So when you're doing Sephardic genealogy, there are two main ways that it might differ from if you're doing Ashkenazi Jewish genealogy. And that is that the Sephardic surnames can go back to 1,000 years. So if you had someone who may be converted, they may have taken a new legal name, but privately they may have kept their family name. So those family names can go back 1,000 years. And so just because someone has the same family name, that doesn't mean you're closely related. Your common ancestor may be back hundreds of years. And then the other main thing is that Sephardics, they actually name children after living relatives. Primarily, they start with the grandparents and then they move on to aunts and uncles. Whereas in Ashkenazi, they don't believe in naming children after living people. So that is kind of something to keep in mind. If you are starting your research in Sephardic genealogy, Jeffrey Malka is kind of the leader in this type of research. He's put together several books, put together the SephardicGen.com website, which is a really great resource. They break it down by country. So if you know what country your ancestors fled to, they'll tell you the different records you can find there and links to those records when possible. And then jewishgen.org also has a Sephardic genealogy section. And if you have gotten back to Portugal, as I mentioned before, the Tour de Tombo has Inquisition records digitized back to the 1500s. And they also have other notarial records, and those are things like contracts, land deeds, and that sort of thing. And then again, what records you're going to be able to find depends on what country they moved to, what records they kept, and what has been digitized. I know I've looked, and the Netherlands actually has quite a bit of the Portuguese Sephardic Jewish community records digitized online. So now we're going to talk about the US side, and I do just want to point out real quickly that there was also large immigration to Canada, but we're going to focus on the US. So there are going to be Portuguese immigrants very early on in American history. Some of them are going to be the sailors, and then you're also going to get the Jewish immigrants fleeing persecution. And the first recorded Portuguese immigrant in the US was Matthias de Souza in Maryland in 1634. And if you guys remember from American history, Maryland was considered the Catholic colony, so that's why he went there. And then Tours Synagogue in Newport was founded in 1763 by Portuguese Jewish settlers, and it is the oldest synagogue in the US. So there's always been Portuguese immigrants in the US. There were three major kind of waves of immigration. The first is 1850 to 1920, and those are mainly Azorians. It's mainly going to be men, and they're going to be the sailors, the fishermen, or the whalers. The second wave is 1958 to 1959, and that's when the volcano the Capalinos erupted on Fayal. The Azorian Refugee Act was passed in 1958, and it was spearheaded by Senator John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts, and we'll find out why here in a minute. And then the second peak is after the immigrant quota system was abolished in 1965. So that's the 1967 to 1980, and that's kind of the largest number of Portuguese immigrants is going to be from this time period. So when the Portuguese settled in US, there are three main areas that they went to. One is the Massachusetts, Rhode Island area. And again, sailors, whalers, the textiles, the mills. Again, those closely aligned with in the Azores, they're mainly fishermen, sailors. They did a lot of textile there. So that's why they would go there. Fall River, Gloucester, New Bedford, Provincetown, and Providence are your main cities in that area where they settled and where you can still find large Portuguese communities. The second area of the US is in California, so the San Joaquin Valley and then San Diego, California. You're going to find Portuguese immigrants as far back as the gold rush in the 1840s in California. And those were mainly whalers, and then they eventually became dairy farmers. And then your third area is the Hawaiian Islands. In 1878, in Hawaii, they decided to kind of start recruiting people to work in the sugarcane plantations there. So you're going to get a lot of Madeirans because, again, sugarcane is big there. And the ukulele actually was brought to Hawaii by Portuguese immigrants. And the picture here is John Philip Sousa, one of the famous American composers. He actually has Portuguese ancestry. So after World War II, again, that kind of later 19th century, that's when you're going to get more of the mainland Iberian Peninsula migration. And that's because of the poverty there. Portugal was at one point one of the poorest countries in Europe, and that was because they were under a fascist dictatorship. So you get people trying to escape that. And then also there's a lot of warfare going on as they're trying to suppress the African colonies and keep them in line. So you get a lot of men who are escaping, not wanting to fight in those wars. So today, California has the largest Portuguese or Portuguese ancestry population. And then Fall River, Massachusetts is the city with the highest proportion of ethnically Portuguese residents. So outside of all that we have just talked about, there is this one group, the Portuguese Presbyterian immigrants. They were from Madeira. 1839, Dr. Clary, who was a Scottish Presbyterian missionary, had to stop in Madeira because his wife was sick as they were journeying elsewhere. He decided to stay and ended up converting several hundred of the people there. However, Protestantism was not allowed in the Portuguese, in anywhere that was ruled by the Portuguese. And they actually used Inquisition rules to get the converts kicked out. So they were all exiled from Madeira, and they originally went to Trinidad and Tobago, but then they eventually ended up in Illinois. They were sponsored by the American Protestant Society, and they went up to New York City before then going west. They settled in Jacksonville in Morgan County, Illinois, and then in Springfield, Illinois. And so in the 1850s, the Portuguese Presbyterians in Jacksonville and Springfield built their own churches, and they were their kind of own communities in Illinois. And people from Illinois from this area, a lot of them actually do have Portuguese ancestry from this group that traveled there. So any of their records in Madeira have been destroyed. Any that would have been kept during the rioting or after they were kicked out, they would have destroyed their churches and destroyed any sign that they were ever there. The people in Madeira that remained. There are records from their churches, the Presbyterian churches they attended in Trinidad, Tobago. As far as I found, they're on microfilm at the University of the West Indies. I don't think those records have been digitized yet. And if you're wanting to know more about this group or different records or the different records of the churches in Illinois, there is a family search wiki page that's called Portuguese Presbyterian Immigrants, and those have lists of resources and links to the various resources that you can check out for this group. So when you're looking at US records, of course, you kind of have your standard. You have the vital records, census, there's church, immigration, newspapers. Vital records is dependent on the state, on what they kept during what time period and what you're going to find. I do know Massachusetts at least has like registers, civil registers for like the late 1800s. For census records, when you're looking on those, where they say they are born is going to differ. They may say they are from Portugal, regardless of where they're from. So even if they're from the Azores and Madeira, they may still say Portugal. They may say Azores, or they may give the specific island they're from. The Azores were also referred to as the Western Islands. So you might see Western Islands or WI in the census records. And then if they're from Madeira, sometimes it might say that. And another thing for the census records is to look for the immigration years, and then in later census records, whether or not they have naturalized, and that'll tell you whether or not you need to look for those records. The other thing is church and synagogue records. So if they were Jewish, you want to look at the synagogues in the areas they lived and see if they still have those records. And then you want to look in the Catholic Church archives, because outside of that Presbyterian group, everyone is going to be Catholic. Immigration and naturalization records, you're going to find a lot of those as well, especially because a lot of those early immigrants, a lot of them were men and a lot of them were going back and forth. It was not uncommon for them to come, stay a while in the US, and then go back to wherever they were from. So they didn't stay in the US permanently. So you might see a lot of going back and forth. And those records are going to show up under immigration and naturalization. And then there are several Portuguese American newspapers that you can look for. And when you're looking for your people, based on my experience, if you're looking like the 1800s or earlier, you want to look under anglicized names usually. And if you're looking in 1900s and later, they tend to kind of go back to the Portuguese spellings and names. But you do want to search both Portuguese names and anglicized names when possible. So with US Catholic Church records, those are kept at the parish. If the church or parish closes, those records go to the diocese. So you want to check with the diocese or archdiocese, those archives, to see, if the church you're looking for, what diocese it falls under and what records they have. This is the list of some of the dioceses. There's the Archdiocese of Boston, which actually has their records from 1709 to 1920 digitized. Those are on AmericanAncestors.org. There's also the Diocese of Fall River, of Providence, San Diego, Stockton, Fresno are the California ones. And then there's the Diocese of Honolulu, which their website says they're no longer accepting genealogical requests. So I would start with the churches in Hawaii and then maybe reach out to the diocese if you have to and just kind of see what's going on with their archives, if you can get records from them or not. So with immigration and naturalization, you do have kind of your standard passenger lists, your passport applications. There's the consular applications. So if, someone from the Azores went back to the Azores to visit, when they were coming back, they would have had to get a consular application to come back to the US. And then, of course, there's your naturalization records. Hawaii has kind of their own separate records. They have their own passport records and the citizenship certificates that they granted certain people. Another category to look for are the seamen, sailors, crew lists. The main one are these seaman protection certificates, 1916 to 1940. There are different levels of seaman records for different states and different time periods. Those are all on Ancestry. So if you just go on Ancestry and search in their card catalog, you can find all these different types of records for the people who were, sailors and that sort of thing. And then Family Search has crew lists and emergency passport applications, as well as passenger lists and some naturalization records. So when it comes to immigration and naturalization on the American side, Ancestry and Family Search are going to be your best places to search. So the largest Portuguese American newspaper collection is with the Dartmouth. They have like I said, the largest collection of newspapers, and they have a database that you can search. It's a little of an older database, so it can be a little bit glitchy sometimes, but you can still get some really good stuff from it. So this is just an example of a newspaper page from the Diario de Noticias from New Bedford, Massachusetts, 1948. And when you're searching through the UMass database, they give you the whole page, so you have to download it by the whole page. But something that we are looking at is down here at the bottom. And this is, these are going to kind of be like the community news from Lajes de Pico in the Azores. And then this little paragraph right here is something we're looking for. And this is actually the obituary for Antonio that we talked about way back 30 minutes ago. He passed away in 1948. So it mentions, this is, the English translation, but it mentions who his son is, his son-in-law, and then it says that the Lajeunesse Philharmonic Orchestra was at his funeral. And it also says he is a widower. So that is a clue that Francisca died before him, and to look for her death records before that. So if you're interested in any other Portuguese records on the American side, the UMass Dartmouth has the Ferreira Mendes Portuguese American Archives. It's one of the largest in the country. There's also the Portuguese Heritage Society of California in San Jose. The UC Berkeley has an oral history program on the Portuguese in California that talks about those early California settlers. There's also the Cal Luso group. For those who don't know, if you see something that says Luso American, that's Portuguese. That's just kind of another way they say that. But that group celebrates the heritage of Portuguese culture. UMass in Lowell has Portuguese American Digital Archives. So that's like photographs and records, primarily from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And then the New Bedford Whaling Museum has some records online as well. And it's a really good resource, especially if you're interested in just kind of like the general whaling history, if you have ancestors who were whalers in that area. So we can kind of go over any questions now that might have popped up.
We do have a couple questions. So, one is somebody mentions that their eighth great grandfather came from Portugal and moved to Quebec in the 1660s, and they're wondering if Quebec was a common place to immigrate to.
There was Canadian immigration there. Again, Catholics, because the French are Catholic, and so Quebec is an especially Catholic area, so that makes sense. Anytime you're looking at Catholic families, they're going to go to areas where there are other Catholics. So yeah, Portuguese going to Quebec makes sense because they're going with people with similar religious beliefs as them. And the Quebec, there's a Drouin collection on Ancestry that you can search for those church records, and there's other various places that you can search for church records for Quebec.
Thank you. It looks like we have one more. So this person is asking about any suggestions to narrow down a common name. Francisco Raposa, and it says the daughter reported São Miguel, but no idea of county.
Yeah, São Miguel, that's in the Azores. If you have a birth date or a year, you can go into that website that I showed that had the Azores, the parish registers, and you can go into that island. I don't know how many councils there are on São Miguel. You can kind of look around if she has any other naturalization records, or if you can find any other vital records from the American side, they may give the name of a town. And you can kind of narrow it down that way. If not, then it's just kind of a matter of you have to go to the São Miguel parish registers and then kind of go council by council, looking through baptismal records for the time period that she was born, which I know sounds like a lot and it's tedious, but if you can find that baptismal record, like I said, you're going to get her parents and then her grandparents, and then you're off. So
Thank you. So I think that'll finish us up, and I did put our email address in the chat. It's genealogy@acpl.info. So if anybody would like a copy of the chat, or if you have additional questions, we'll be glad to try to answer those there. So thank you, Christina, and thank you to everybody for attending.